The defining event of the 1930s, really across the globe, was the Great Depression. And here's what we can say about the Great Depression. It was depressing. Depression is an economic term that means that there has been negative economic growth. Another way to say that is the economy has contracted for 4 consecutive business quarters, or for 1 year. That's a pretty fancy definition, but depression is an accurate term because the depression is depressing. And really, in a very practical way, what an economic depression means is that there are no jobs, or there is very high unemployment. There are not enough jobs for the people who want them, and thus income and spending are quite negatively affected. The Great Depression of the 1930s was a global depression. It affected all the countries of Europe. It affected the United States. It had many and varied causes, and it was long-lasting and had profound effects. So what caused this great economic travesty of the 1930s? It's really hard to pinpoint any one individual cause. I like this slide. Look at the top. Historians disagree as to the causes of the Great Depression, but most would include, and here's a list of the following. And so historians disagree. It's hard to look at any one particular thing and say this is what led to this global economic calamity, but there were many contributing factors that resulted in this snowball. I'm going to address just a few. High tariffs and war debts. We have talked about the war debts and the problems of reparations already in looking at the Treaty of Versailles and the economic strain that this placed on Germany and other countries in Europe. Also, in the 1920s, in part of the recovery from the war, nations of Europe and the United States in particular really turned inward. They instituted very high tariffs to protect and promote their own industries in the economic recovery. And this led away from free trade, which ended up having a pretty negative effect on the economy overall, although these policies were politically popular in the aftermath of the war, when everybody wanted to kind of be insular and look inward and not be so concerned with other countries in the world. You know, everyone just kind of wanted to turn their head towards their own little nest and their own place and not deal with other countries so much. Overproduction is a pretty big cause here. We talked about the general strike in England in 1926, and this was due to a significant amount of overproduction in the coal industry, which ended up having a huge effect on England all through the 1930s. And coal wasn't the only industry in which this happened, but let's use it because it is a great example. There was too much coal on the market, more than was demanded, and that pushed down prices worldwide, and there was a glut, and it wasn't just in coal, it was in steel and in other manufactured goods. And coal was what historians call a sick industry. There were several of them at this time. They're just suffering from overproduction, and they were forced to lay off thousands and thousands and thousands of workers and to close operations. And there's no fix for that except to fix the glut in the market, to fix the oversupply. And so there are overproductions in a number of industries worldwide. Next, we're going to talk about the stock market crash in the United States. This can really be looked at like the startling start of the Great Depression, and it can be considered a cause because it caused a great amount of wealth to evaporate, and financial panic ensued, and that is never good. Okay, I love this front page. It's from a Brooklyn newspaper. You can see the complete Long Island News, New York City, New York area newspaper from October 1929. Wall Street in panic as stocks crash. Investing in the stock market was a very trendy and popular thing to do in the 1920s. The consumer boom of the 1920s, we've talked about the just huge consumerism of this era. And this was true in Europe and in the United States. And this is a really important cause of the Great Depression. Led to really the first widespread use of credit on a consumer basis. Now, you guys are probably familiar with a credit card. We didn't have plastic credit cards and Visa and American Express back in the 1920s, but the idea was the same. Stores could offer consumers credit and they could purchase things on credit. And even the stock market in the 1920s, the American stock market, operated on credit. Well, credit can be a great thing if you don't overuse it. Credit is only a bad thing when it is used irresponsibly, and the debts that are assumed on credit cannot be paid. And essentially, there was a crisis of credit in the 1920s. People became well overextended. They owed more than they could pay. It produced a bubble, what we call in the stock market world. It produced a bubble. It pushed prices up artificially high, and then the bubble bursts and there's nothing left. Everything collapses. So, and then a financial panic followed. People made runs on banks. They pulled their cash out of banks. And so where the credit expansion had led people to take on more debt than they could assume, the fallout from the stock market collapse happened very, very quickly. And the net effect of that was for people to pull their real money, their real cash out of banks and out of lending institutions and to stuff it under the proverbial mattress, or maybe it wasn't a proverbial mattress in this case. And so, boom, all of a sudden, money and credit and the economy dries up. Businesses can't hire people, goods can't move around, people can't purchase things, and it becomes kind of a pretty bad snowball, if you will. Now, the stock market crash, so it can be seen as a cause in that regard, and as far as the overextension of credit goes. The stock market crash, however, most historians really consider to be a symptom of the Depression. The same way where if you have an illness, your fever is a symptom. Your fever might be the first thing that tells you that you are sick. But a fever isn't the underlying cause of the illness. Maybe you have strep throat, or you have the flu, or you have some other virus that is causing you to get a fever. And in a lot of ways, the stock market collapse is the fever. It's a symptom of these underlying causes. It's something that happens because of them, because of these underlying causes. But the stock market crash really made it very apparent to the world that there was trouble, and it had a pretty immediate effect. The same way as if you woke up with a very high fever, you would be like, oh my goodness, I'm sick. I need to go to the doctor. I need to figure out what is going on. And so the stock market crash had a really dramatic effect on business and on the ability of corporations to do business. It caused billions of dollars of wealth to simply evaporate, and businesses closed down. It happened in the United States in Wall Street. And so what does this have to do with Europe? Well, because all this cash evaporated, because there was this panic in the United States, remember the Dawes Plan, the way that the Americans were investing a lot of money in Europe to kind of keep it afloat. The effect of the stock market crash in the United States on Europe was that those investments dried up. They got pulled out, and this happened swiftly, and that had a devastating effect on European economies, okay, everywhere from Germany to France and England, etc. Look at this, take a couple of seconds or pause this maybe and look at this front page. Look at how interesting this is. I love to look at front pages of newspapers from any particular day in history. So this is talking about panic sets in as the stocks crash. But look at that, attempt made to kill Italy's crown prince. Assassin caught in Brussels mob. prince unhurt. You see right under there. So I think that speaks to kind of some of the persistence in instability and anarchy in underdeveloped countries like Italy, and just some of the, discontent in the society. There's some other really interesting little headlines in here that not necessarily have to do with European history, but I would encourage you to take a minute to look at it. It can be very interesting. Ramsay MacDonald was elected prime minister, I think, a couple of times in England throughout the 1920s, and I want to use him as an example. He's an interesting person to look at. The reason he's significant is because he was a member of the Labour Party, and he was the first elected prime minister of the Labour Party in England, and the Labour Party was organized to represent the interests of workers, and we know that they had been given the vote, and we talked last unit about the change of liberalism because of workers voting, etc. Now, Ramsay MacDonald, so he rises, the Labour Party and Ramsay MacDonald rise to power on the promise of programs to help workers. His tenure each time was short-lived. Things politically were pretty volatile in England in the 1920s. Their political system does not work the same as ours. I don't want to get into the details of it right now, but suffice it to say that in England, political power shifted back and forth. The Tories, the Labour, the Liberals, they couldn't settle on someone that was happy, that was really successful. You couldn't make the voters happy, I guess you would say. So again, symbols of the discontent. Well, here's what happened. So the 1920s and the early 20th century, looking for a good time for workers, and indeed politically they were, and we've talked about how their fortunes improved. The rise of communism in Russia, however, and the success of the Bolsheviks in their civil war had a pretty disquieting effect in Western Europe on these kind of pro-worker solidarity and worker political parties, etc., for fear of the spread of communism. For fear of the spread of communism. The 1920s in the Western democracies are definitely a time of what we might call Red Scare, that people were afraid of communism. And so Ramsay MacDonald's failure to keep his position or failure to institute really worker-friendly policies as prime minister or in power had to do with this Red Scare, that nothing could look too communist. Nothing could look too communist. We had to stay away from the specter of communism. And when we talked about the general strike in London, I asked you what's going to be the fear if you have these large groups of people present in public? Well, that could lead to revolution. And certainly in the Western countries, in the United States, in England, and in France in particular, in the 1920s and going into the early 1930s, the years of the Great Depression, the governments pushed back really, really hard against large groups, against large groups and against this amassing of discontented, out-of-work men for fear of revolution. But revolution never materialized in any of these countries in the 1920s or in the 1930s. But you do see over and over again these kind of large groups, these marches, these groups of men be pretty forcefully disbanded. So here's a hunger march going on London. Unemployed workers, again, mainly from the coal lands up in the northern part of England, the coal towns, etc. They're marching to London. They are demanding in the 1930s, they're demanding action on the part of the government. The Hunger March, the name of this march is very, very telling. These men were out of work. They had lost their income. They were hungry. They needed some relief. They were met with quite a bit of hostility when they arrived in London. You can see here the police on horseback forcefully disbanding the hunger marchers. Similar events happened in all over Western Europe, in France, in Germany. We'll talk later on about what happens there in the United States. Okay, similar events happen there. But in order to calm the emergency, let's say, in the Great Depression, governments had to respond, and governments had to respond in an unprecedented scale of involvement in people's daily lives and in direct sort of welfare kind of kinds of programs. And this happened in England, France, and in the United States, that the emergency was such that governments intervened on a massive and unprecedented scale that hadn't really been seen yet in European or American history. So the hunger marchers are disbanded. So how did these governments respond besides driving people out of the street? Charities and government programs opened and funded bread lines and soup kitchens. It was very common to see a site like this. This is from London, but they would have been in New York and Boston and Paris and all across the major cities of Europe and the United States. People standing in line to get a handout of food and bread and coffee. Here's another image from London. We demand relief, release us from hunger. We demand winter relief. And governments generally cooperated with this, especially in England. The response of the government in the 1920s and 30s was to make direct cash payments to men who were unemployed. And this was called the dole. And so the unemployed in England in the 1930s, really, you have a pretty big social and cultural shift here. This idea of living on the dole, on the government handout that was barely a subsistence level handout, but it was really all the government could do to respond. And this is how England tackled the problem instead of massive public works or anything like that. Okay, they started handing out the dole, trying to get unemployed men off the street, give them something to keep them from rebelling, to keep them from revolting. And this plan didn't solve the underlying problems, but it did quiet the emergency. The dole did. It did quiet the emergency in combination with the bread lines and the soup kitchens, but these were very lean and meager times in England, which was really devastated economically. I like this picture because I think it shows one of the great social impacts of the Great Depression, which was the reversal of gender roles. And this was especially true in England and Ireland and places within the British Empire because of the dole. Men didn't go to work. Men received the dole for unemployed men. And a lot of women in working class homes and families could find employment. They could find employment doing laundry or doing some kind of other piecework. Women were cheaper to hire. And so while unemployment was generally widespread in the Great Depression, it was in England especially, it was easier for a woman to get a job. So there was a general kind of reversal of gender roles with the man in the house. There's a man in the home with the children, and the woman is outside working on some laundry. And this was disquieting from a social perspective because it was so immediate and it really had a generational impact. And while this wasn't as widespread, one of the very significant effects of the Great Depression in both the United States and in England, because of these situations, was for men to walk away from their families, to abandon their families for their failure to be able to provide for them, to look for life on their own, as being easier on everyone. And while that was not the majority response, it was an extreme response, but it did happen. It was a very sad side effect of these difficult times. In France, there was some political discord and upheaval. I know you'll find that hard to believe. Okay. But the French actually were faring a little bit better than the British, actually a lot better. Their economy was more diversified going into the Great Depression, and so while the Depression hit them hard and they were still struggling in the aftermath of the war, France was not as bad off as England, and it wasn't as badly off as the United States. But France was suffering from its continuing political divisions again, and France was really, in the early 1930s, vulnerable to the rise of fascism. I will talk in the next PowerPoint more about specifically what fascism is, but for right now, let's say fascism is a very right-wing, very conservative, strongly nationalistic political ideology that is anti-democratic. And so a government called the Popular Front in France emerged as a way to hold off fascism, in fear of fascism. And the Popular Front was a coalition government. It was essentially all the different political groups in France who were not fascist coming together and saying, hey, maybe we need to set our differences aside in order to keep the fascists from coming to power. And so you can see here who made up the Popular Front, and you can see the divisions. Okay, France was strongly right-wing and strongly left-wing. The light purple in the middle, the single largest group, radicals and various lefts. Because they were the largest group, they were able to effectively organize this. And the Popular Front was a left-leaning, kind of government, but by no means communistic, by no means communist. And so what I'm saying here is these radicals and leftists set aside perhaps what they really wanted to do in the interest of cooperation with other political groups in order to hold off the fascists. And then the red and dark red are left-leaning groups, and then the blue represent more conservative forces in French politics. The president of the Republic in the government of the Popular Front was a guy named Léon Blum. Blum and the Popular Front government instituted what became known as the French New Deal. The New Deal was a very aggressive set of policy responses being used by the American government to try to tamp down the Depression in the United States, and you'll learn all about that in U.S. history next year. But the French government instituted a very similar plan. It was quite aggressive and it was worker friendly, and the point was to keep workers happy and to keep workers working. And so the French New Deal, like the American New Deal, included programs in public works to put men to work. It protected wages. It did its best to protect jobs. It limited hours and provided other means of welfare to help people sustain. And generally, going through the 1930s, not that France was unaffected by the Great Depression, they certainly were, but you can look at the success of the Popular Front and their policies and saying, well, it didn't get any worse. It could have definitely been worse. The Great Depression in the 1930s were a difficult time, an incredibly difficult time for all nations. The Western democracies, even though times were hard and volatile, maintained democratic governments. In Italy and Germany and other countries in Central Europe, as we shall see in the next PowerPoint, they turned away from democracy.